Ryan, and if you recognized most of those images, then that means it's probably time to go see the doctor for a checkup of some sort. I'm glad you chose to be here with us tonight. You know, whether you're here live or you're picking us up on the internet later, I'm really excited to start this series about families. And what's really wild about this idea of families is that it's extremely applicable to all of us because we're all a part of some sort of family. Now, whether we like our families, whether they like us, whether we have a relationship with our families or not, that's another conversation. However, when we talk about families, when you hear the word family, what type of word comes, or what imagery comes to mind for you to describe that? Now, if we get into our Wayback Machine and we look back over the years of TV shows that have tried to define families for us, maybe some of us think of Leave It to Beaver, the nuclear family with mom and dad, 2 kids, you know, this past image of what many said was the ideal family. And in the 70s, that started to change with the TV show The Jeffersons and shows like that where there was these conflicts with culture and blended families, and we started being introduced to single-parent families, and it was becoming prominent. And the ideal Cleaver family image started to look more like perhaps the real families that we lived and worked with every day. You know, we had the not-so-perfect families of the 80s and 90s, one far from the idea of our original Leave It to Beaver theme, you know, Roseanne and The Simpsons, just to name a couple. And nowadays we see TV trying to deconstruct the idea of family or what it is that family means. Maybe you don't think of TV series when you think of family. Maybe you think of things like awkward family photos. You know, when you think family, you know, I only wish Santa would unload some of that at my house.
Oh my goodness.
Perhaps you've got one of those family photos where you thought, man, I looked goofy. My hair was so bad. And what's up with the sweater I'm wearing?
Oh gosh.
Whatever you think of when you hear the word family, I gather that many of us see it as probably the hardest, most rewarding part of our entire lives. For some of us, family brings up positive stuff, togetherness, love, acceptance. Others of us maybe have negative feelings towards the word family. We think of shame, fear, loss, abandonment, divorce, or abuse. Sometimes it's so difficult because when you hear the words mom, dad, son, daughter, it's never emotionally neutral. And even when we think of those words, there's different memories and perceptions and a variety of experience that come because every one of us has had a different experience. Yet we all have one thing in common when it comes to this idea of family, and that is that when it comes to our family of origin, we didn't have any choice in the matter. We can choose our friends, but we can't choose our family. What was one we said as kids? You can pick your nose, you can pick your friends, you can't pick your family. Perhaps you had an experience like mine where the neighbor kid friend, their family was the family that you wanted to be a part of because you thought they were just so perfect. You know, they had a TV with cable, something we didn't have in my house. No offense, Mom. I mean, I'm not saying it. I'm just, you know, maybe you had these misconceptions, you know. They had MTV, which there was a time, believe it or not, you could actually listen to music and watch music videos. Maybe they had video games. Maybe they had air conditioning in the house. Something I didn't have till later in life, right? I mean, whatever it was, you just thought, man, this family is so cool. They're so ideal. However, my hope is that by the end of this series that we're entering into, you'll realize that there is no perfect family. There's just real families. Now, another thing we all have in common is that at some point we thought, no one I'm related to is as smart as I am when it comes to my family. You know, a lot of us have opinions about our families, and if they could just see the world the way we do things, it'd just go a lot better. And when we open up scriptures, the concept of family, if we open it up and we look at it, we look at the concept of family in the scriptures and we take a survey of it all, we find not a lot of great examples. There's no perfect families even in the Bible, just real families. Even Jesus, the Son of God, his parents lost him at the temple when he was a little boy. Their only kid, and they lost him. His own brothers later in his ministry thought he was crazy and would shun him and not want a lot to do with him. His earthly family was even dysfunctional. But if we look back prior to Jesus' arrival here on earth, prior to the establishment of the church, prior to the Israelites, what we see is that family was the first institution created by God. And it's been a beautiful mess ever since then. In the first family, they were an absolute disaster. The first couple fight introduced sin into the human race. What do you want to eat tonight? I don't know. What do you want to eat tonight? I'll eat whatever you want to eat. Well, let's have this apple. And they ruined it for us. The first recorded homicide is committed in the first family of the Bible, Cain and Abel. But wait, there's more. In the Old Testament, there's a civil war in the nation of Israel because of a father and son conflict where thousands of people die. So the Old Testament has a lot of really rough family stories. But can't you appreciate the intellectual honesty of the Bible? Inviting us into the very human interaction, and at the same time, God's story being unfolded on what he's doing in the world. There's some great principles for family, for sure, but there's some great pictures of a real family when we look through the Bible. Then we flip over to the New Testament, and Paul, he takes the teachings of Jesus, and he goes around the Mediterranean rim planting these churches all over. And he applied the gospel of Jesus to this topic of family. And so, if I can, I'm going to read kind of a summary of the New Testament teachings on family. Now, for many of us hearing it today, we probably think, man, Ryan, this sounds old-fashioned. But Paul is conveying to these early century people an idea that is revolutionary to them in regards to family and treating each other. It's brand new at that time. And the world had never heard of something like the teachings of Jesus applied to the family. The dignity given to women and children were incredible. No one at that time could imagine a world where men, women, and children were all considered valuable, where women and children were just as important as men. And it was a very patriarchal culture where men had all the power. And no one at that time in the world was saying, yeah, we champion women and children, go team. And so here comes this guy, Jesus, on the scene, and he's elevating the status of women and children. And Paul follows after him, continuing that trajectory. And so Paul goes on to say this, that when Jesus died on the cross, he died for all men, women, and children equally. They're all co-heirs in the kingdom of God. So Paul takes this teachings and he says that in light of that, here's how families should work. And so here's a summary of more of Paul's writings. He says, husbands, love your wives, and husbands, lay down your life, your rights for your wife out of reverence for Christ. And he says, wives, love your husbands by surrendering to them out of reverence for Christ. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, don't irritate your children. But that's the summary of the New Testament teachings. And we may think it's old hat or old-fashioned, but we got to understand this world, this Greco-Roman culture. They just took a shot across the bow of patriarchy. To say, men, lay down your lives, love your wife as Christ loves the church. Men, die. Be willing to die to yourself, to give up everything. To even go as far to say, hey, love and respect your slaves or your hired help. And this was totally not the norm at that time in the culture. Perhaps we read these words from Paul and we think it seems pretty basic, kind of idealistic. But this idea points us to a tension of family. We all have an ideal image of what we feel family should be like versus what is really happening to us. And what happens is we're all trying to manage this tension of the real and the ideal. The situation we find ourselves in when it comes to the hard, conflictual, not perfect reality and the ideal of what God says about family. What Jesus teaches about family, or what we want to have happen, perhaps the values that we want our family to hold, we're all caught in the middle of this tension, real and ideal. But here's what's awesome about Jesus when it comes to relationships and family. Jesus always points us to the ideal, but he refuses to condemn those who fall short. And every aspect of life from the Old Testament going into the New Testament, Jesus raised the standard. He took the Old Testament law and he actually raised the standard. For example, Jewish law, the payment for adultery was capital punishment. And Jesus comes on the scene and he said, hey, let's raise that standard a little bit higher. He said, if you even look at a woman lustfully and lust after her in your heart, then you've committed adultery. And in that moment, Jesus made everyone listening potentially an adulterer. He took a standard and he raised it. So all of us would say, okay, Jesus, but now what happens to all of us? We're all guilty of this sin. And then Jesus, he says, well, I'm going to forgive you. And so some would ask then, the religious leaders even would say, well, Jesus, so, is this a rule? Or are you going to forgive us? And Jesus says, yeah, exactly. Because the standard got higher. But because of the cross of Jesus Christ, the grace got deeper. The forgiveness got richer as the standard got higher and the inclusion got broader. And this is how Jesus functioned. This is the embodiment of Jesus' gospel. In John, he wrote that Jesus came in grace and truth. In other words, Jesus had the real and he had the ideal. And he came and he pointed us to the ideal of what God desired for our lives, and yet he refused to condemn those who fell short. And so here's the tension. The decision you and I are going to have to make when it comes to family over the next few weeks of this series. Are you willing to embrace an ideal that may never be reality in our current family? Or will you be tempted to lose sight of the ideal to settle for feeling better about where you actually are? See, unlike us, Jesus, he was comfortable with this tension. He knew how to work in it and be in it. We like to have answers. We want to know what's concrete. We don't like gray areas. We want to know the extremes. We want the exact answers. But those of us who are followers of Jesus, we need to learn to be comfortable in this tension as well. Jesus was really comfortable with one family issue, the issue of divorce. If we look at Matthew 19, starting at 3, some Pharisees came to him to test him, because that's what they were always doing. And they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Well, first we need to understand, first century Judaism had a no-fault divorce system, and it was brutal. If a man wanted to divorce his wife, he could for any reason that displeased him. He could say, I divorce you, and kick her out the door. Because men at that time held all the power. And as a woman at that time, if you wanted to divorce your husband, sorry, you're stuck with him. However, Jesus taught something that the religious leaders thought was different than what Moses had taught them. So they're trying to divide Jesus and Moses because that would allow them to put disbelief in the people that Jesus wasn't who he said he was. And so Jesus replied to him, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, back when things were ideal, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. And the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus takes the religious leaders at that time and he takes them back to the original intention. He tells them, your discussion about divorce, it's not relevant because you don't even understand what marriage is and what the intention of God was when it came to marriage. See, God made two people to be one. So when they get married, they become one, and you can never un-one in God's eyes what he's made one. He says you're not looking at you're only looking at the real, and you've lost sight of the ideal. Jesus is saying, I'm willing to give you both, and I'm willing to teach you how to work in this tension. He's saying, I understand things don't always work out. And there's other things Jesus had to say about a lot of these conditions when it comes to marriage and family regarding unfaithfulness, abuse, things like that. Jesus says, I understand. People get divorced. But I'm not losing sight of God's ideal. And rather than solve your problem, Jesus tells them, I'm just going to give you this tension to learn to manage. And so then they fire back. Why then, they ask, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. So the religious leaders, right here, they're asking, well then, Jesus, what are we supposed to do with these divorced people now? And in such a Jesus response, he says, I'm not doing anything to them. I am, however, going to do something for them. Jesus said, I'm going to provide a way for them to have forgiveness. Oh, so let them off the hook, Jesus? Is that it? I mean, Jesus, is this a rule or is it not a rule? And Jesus answers, yes. Jesus gives us the tension of the real and the ideal, the tension of grace and truth. And when it comes to how we live our lives, we dare not resolve this idea, because to resolve it is to lose something incredibly important about the way of Jesus, who came both full of grace and truth. Now, if you're not a Christian, you're not a believer, I get that this can be a little much to take in. And perhaps you have a lot of questions. I get it. And last year we completed a series about where we questioned who needs God. And we questioned religion. And I'd encourage you to go back through our YouTube videos where they're saved there and have a review of those. Not expecting anyone to live out these principles, but to understand over the next few weeks that the way of Jesus is better. Now, if you are a believer in Jesus, he's inviting us to go into the complexity of family and to carry this tension between what is real, the things that I see around me, and the ideal, which kind of seems like few people can embrace. So the question is, will we embrace a standard that many of us have fallen short of, or will we redefine terms so that we can feel better about where we are? Are we willing in our inability to look at Jesus' ideal to say, that's what the ideal family looks like? Even though I may never attain it, even though I've had stuff that is outside of my control, maybe even though I went through a divorce and I've had things happen, and I'm still willing to keep my eye on that North Star of guidance, that Jesus' plan is ideal. Am I willing to teach the next generation about it, even though it hasn't happened in my life, and hope that it can still happen? Or am I just going to change the rules so that I feel better about where I'm at? And I understand there's a lot of different people, a lot of different circumstances that people are in. And, divorce because of unfaithfulness, domestic violence, or abuse of some form. And to say, to stay in a marriage like that would contradict a lot of what Jesus said about what a healthy marriage is. So understand that everything I'm talking about is not a blanket statement on your situation. Perhaps you felt condemned or hurt by the church because of the way it responded and handled your situation, that they didn't handle the tension well between the real and the ideal. Perhaps the church at that time threw all the weight of truth and ideal on you without any grace, any understanding, or any empathy. I remember witnessing it that one night at the fireside. A guy mentioned he was going through divorce, and a guy stood up and just threw all of this truth and ideal of God's plan for us at him, so heavy and hard. And I remember how much my heart hurt for that guy, struggling to open up and share that. And if you've ever had a situation like that, I hope that I want to say that I'm sorry that happened to you. And I want people to hear, I want you to hear that, I get it, I really do. However, let me offer to you today this tension that Jesus offered the first century audience that is still going on and being offered us today. This tension of grace and truth, the real and the ideal, it's not something to solve. It's not a problem to solve. It's a tension for us to learn to manage. In fact, I have yet to meet someone who went through divorce who wants automatically for their child to be divorced. I have yet to meet a single parent who says, I really want my child to just be a single parent and go through all that struggle too. In fact, men and women who have experienced the pain, the hopelessness, the desperation, and the hardship of divorce are usually the ones who want success for their children, who want successful marriages for their children. And that's why we don't want to lose sight of the ideal, even though both sides of this equation remind us of the pain we want to forget. We do not want to lose the ideal because the one who pays the most throughout history, the one who always pays the most out of these deals when we work too hard with the truth and throw it, is women and children. Women and children are often thrust below the poverty line through these circumstances, the socioeconomic line. They're given a stigma when we don't live out the way God has asked us to live. However, at the same time, we worship and love a God who's willing to die for us, who's willing to see the worst parts of us and love us at the same time. See, there's no one life that's unaffected by the bad things we do, but God's love is so strong, it stays constant and steady. So this tension between the real and the ideal, we dare not resolve it. Some of us might ask, so what does that look like in my family today? Well, the futures of our families depend on our ability to live within the tension and manage it well, as Jesus would want us to manage it. And so what does embracing the tension of real grace and the ideal truth look like in my family? Whether it's a single parent, a foster parent, an adoptive parent, a single person, thinking about your future spouse and family, grandparent, empty nesters, we're pretty close. We're almost there. College student, school-aged child. What does it look like to live out grace and truth in your family context? So as we close in prayer tonight, I'd like for you to ask God to highlight a relationship in your life that you need to manage the tension better between grace and truth. Some of us are really good at giving out grace, and some of us are really good at hammering out truth to those who don't look like us, act like us, or are like us. Don't forget the example of Jesus. He died to bring us into a new family, the family of God. Now, if you've been broken and hurt by your family of origin, know that Jesus died to give you a new spiritual family, his church, and that's us. We're here to be family with each other. And God sometimes heals us and brings us redemption through our second family, our faith family. Won't you pray with me? God, thank you that we can come to your courts and we can enter with praise. And we know that through your word, we can learn to be better husbands, wives, children, that we can learn to be better parents, better community members. That as we chase after Jesus and his holiness, that you don't just affect our personal life, but you affect our families. And as we talk these next few weeks about families, let us consider how we manage this tension of grace and truth. The ideal life you planned for us at the beginning versus the real life that we live and work in every day. Help us learn to manage that. Help us learn to manage that real and ideal in a broken relationship that we have today, to bring back unity. And bring healing to all of our community that have been hurt by the church, that has been too heavy on the truth and not learned to work and manage that tension between grace and truth. We love you and we thank you for everything you do in our lives. In Jesus' name.